Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and this is another article review. Now this one's going to be pretty short because I'm only dealing with one topic. And the article that I'm looking at is from the Greek Orthodox Church of America. I'm looking at their website, goarc.org/rfaith/rfaith7063. And I'm specifically looking at the part that has been entitled Faith Which Worketh Through Love. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I'm definitely a Protestant. In fact, I'm a Pentecostal evangelical, and so yeah, I don't really have a whole lot in common with the Eastern Orthodoxy, and this is an Eastern Orthodox website, and it's definitely presenting an Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox perspective. Now, there's lots of things that we could say about different groups within Christianity and their beliefs and why I don't happen to believe them and that sort of thing. But we're going to hone in on just one particular issue that I take a great issue with when it comes to Eastern Orthodoxy. That is the main reason why I do not accept Eastern Orthodoxy has a lot to do with the same reason why I don't accept lots of things as being the true faith. And that is generally something that's just true of Christianity in general, is that it's very easy to speak lies, either intentionally or accidentally. And frankly, those of us who are Protestants are no different on this one. The number of things that you can hear in, say, a Protestant sermon regarding either history or what the Bible has to say or something like this, you can find tons of lies in just about any given sermon. People make mistakes. People are fallible. What I enjoy about Protestantism, though, is that there really is no fundamental hiding of that fact. One of our fundamental premises is the fallibility of mankind. Excuse me. And this is why basically Protestantism is the way that it is regarding church history and these kinds of things. Sometimes that's to our detriment, in that there were people who thought about these things long before we did, and there is certainly wisdom to be gained from them. But also, at the same time, it's also to our betterment, in that we are not bound by essentially man's philosophy, good or bad, which means there's a high degree of personal responsibility in Protestantism. Now, as it relates to Eastern Orthodoxy here, there's this one little snippet in the article, and like I said, there we could go through and talk about lots of things, but there's one little snippet in the article that I take a lot of issue with, just simply because of what it's trying to represent. I'll go ahead and read it for you. This is what the article says. In that respect, the Church fought against two extremes. One, the theory that the innate sinfulness of mankind, human nature, is able to practice virtue by itself, making Christ's sacrifice only a moral example, Pelagianism. Two, the theory that the human soul is totally corrupted and man's salvation is God's work alone, predestining man to salvation or to perdition. And they're accrediting that to Augustine. So that's the statement. And with most Eastern Orthodox people that I've talked to, and granted I haven't talked to a whole lot, but this is usually one of the issues that comes up when you talk to them about salvation, is that they say that their church kind of takes a middle road between these two extremes. On the one hand, that mankind in and of himself is essentially able to effect his own salvation, which is the era of Pelagius. And then on the other hand, you have that mankind is able to do nothing of himself, that is in what we would call a state of total depravity. And that is often accredited to Augustine. Personally, when I read through the Church Fathers, I find more than just Augustine who cited on this issue. That's another issue, and I won't be arguing that. My point here is very simple. They put this out as this either and neither one's right, so you have to choose a middle ground kind of thing. But the thing that they never bring up is that Pelagius was condemned in synod. However, Augustine, or Augustine, it's the same dude, he was actually never condemned in council. So this is something that they are back applying. This is not actually a part of the historical faith. And if you read through the early synods and the early councils, you realize that Augustine was actually much more so considered typical. Pelagius, of course, was not. Here's an example. The Council of Carthage is the council that condemned Pelagius and refuted what he had to say quite roundly. And you'll notice that the verbiage that it uses to refute Pelagius is very much so Augustine in nature. And here's the thing. It was Pelagius who was condemned. It wasn't Augustine. In his time, and even for much time after that, and certainly accepted by at least the Western tradition, that was the accepted norm. It was the accepted norm before him. It was an accepted norm after him. And here's what the actual council had to say, and this is important because the Eastern Orthodox claim to hold to the 7 ecumenical councils. And here's where it gets interesting. The council that I'm going to read from, I actually have the book with me. This council was actually ratified by the 7th Ecumenical Council. The Eastern Orthodox claim to follow the 7 ecumenical councils. So if they're going to be honest, then they're also going to have to adhere to this. But frankly, they're not going to do that. So here's one of the councils, one of the canons that are found in this particular council, the Council of Carthage. Alright, and this would, I'm going to use the Greek canon numbers because that's what the Eastern Orthodox would typically be more used to going with rather than the Western canon numbers. Alright, so the Greek canon number for this one is 112 from the Council of Carthage, and it says in that particular canon, it says lots of things in that canon, but one of the things it says is this: "For no otherwise can be understood what the Apostle says, by one man sin has come into the world, and death through sin, and so death passed upon all men, and that all have sinned, then the Catholic Church everywhere diffused has always understood it. For on account of this rule of faith, even infants, who could have committed yet no sin themselves, therefore are truly baptized for the remission of sins, in order that what in them is the result of generation may be cleansed by regeneration." What is this? This is the doctrine of original sin in canon form. Pelagius, of course, rejected original sin. Augustine, on the other hand, was all about original sin, and the synod that was ratified by the 7th Ecumenical Council came out on the side of Augustine. That's what it says. It says that even infants are born with an original sin, not just ancestral sin, but they are born with an original sin. So much so that even though committing nothing of themselves, they have a guiltiness to them, in effect. So for Eastern Orthodox people who try to reject original sin, and the Eastern Orthodox are very definitive on not advocating original sin, what you have is that they are going against what the early church has decided in synod as ratified by the 7th Ecumenical Council. It's all here in black and white. Another interesting canon that is in here, and this one for the Greek council numbers would be canon number. Too many C's, sorry. Alright, so the Greek canon number for this next one would be 114, and it says as follows: "It seemed good that whoever should say that the grace of justification was given to us only that we might be more ably ready by grace to perform what we were ordered to do through our free will, as if, though grace were not given, although not easily, yet nonetheless we could even without grace fulfill the divine commandments, let him be anathema. For the Lord spake concerning the fruits of the commandments, when he said, without me you can do nothing. And not, without me you could do it, but with difficulty." What is this talking about? This is talking about a state of total depravity. What is it that they cite as evidence for this claim? That we are totally depraved, that we cannot help ourselves. They quote the Lord, "Without me you can do nothing. With man this is impossible." This is what Jesus said, and they're bringing this topic up. Not necessarily because it's directly related to what they're saying, but it epitomizes the view of the church at the time. And without me you can do nothing. Remember, even though the Eastern Orthodox like to put Pelagius and Augustine up on opposite sides of the venue here and say one is too extreme this way and one's too extreme that way, the truth of the matter is that Augustine was never anathematized. Pelagius was. Augustine was ratified in synod, and that synod was ratified by the Seventh Ecumenical Council. This is the belief of the undivided church. Now, granted, as a Protestant, I'm not really bound to either one, because Protestants do not view history as binding. We view history as the product of humanity, and humanity is fallible. And so we're not bound to this in any way. And so we could, if we wanted to, reject both Pelagius and Augustine out of hand if we found that such was in good keeping with the Scriptures. Because for a Protestant, Scripture is the primary standard. It's the sole unsurpassable standard and rule of the faith. And so that's just where our ultimate appeal will be. But for the Eastern Orthodox, who claim to represent the historical faith, and they're saying that this is the historical faith, that we take this middle ground, well, that's not what the history actually records. That is something, the idea of following the middle ground is something that actually came about much later. Anything that even had a hint of Pelagianism in it was soundly rejected. And not just once, but it was put into synod, and it was also ratified by the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And yet they claim to follow the Seventh Ecumenical Council. They claim to follow the seven ecumenical councils and the synods. They don't. That's the simple historical truth here. They don't do what they claim that they do. And this is one of my biggest problems with Eastern Orthodoxy. They twist and they manipulate the history to make it say things that it never actually said. Now, granted, their view of history, of course, is going to be different from the West, because basically they have different source materials. And if you read through the Greek records of most of these things, and you also read through the Latin records of these things, you'll see that the two are definitely different. There's no doubt about that. But this is the same in either one. And yet they say, we follow this except where we don't like it. That's essentially what it comes out to be. And that's the problem with Eastern Orthodoxy, and also with the Western Church as well, Roman Catholicism, is that they claim to be historical, but whenever you point out something in the history that doesn't jive with what they now believe, they basically will say, well, this is what the church has eventually decided, yada, yada, yada. It basically becomes sola ecclesia. They aren't really bound to the history. They pick and choose. And frankly, every group does that. The Western Church has their fathers that they go to, the Eastern Church has their fathers that they go to, and we as Protestants have particular fathers that we go to. But the question that I would ask is, which one is actually being consistent? For the Protestants, who do not imbue mankind or the fathers of the Church with any special authority beyond that given to any man, the idea of picking and choosing ones that support your particular claim is entirely consistent. We don't say that we follow the historical faith represented through all these centuries. That is, we go back to our source material, going back from the 1st century and before with the Old Testament, and we go from that standard and we use what comes later to help us understand that period, but is ultimately that period in that source documentation that guides us. So the later stuff isn't binding for us, and we don't treat it as binding. So yes, we will use some of the church fathers, and we won't use some of the others. Some of the stuff that's said in council, Protestants do agree with. We can generally agree with most of the stuff put forward at the Council of Nicaea, at least the creed. Some of the canons, not so much. Some of those get into a very distinct form of legalism, especially if you take them to their nth implication. But there's a lot that we would agree with, but we're not bound to it, because those are basically emblems of how it was lived out at one point. Sometimes we find out later on that decisions that we made were not based on all of the information available to us. And that's really what Protestantism is. Can you change your mind if you happen to encounter new information? In Protestantism, that's a yes. In the traditional churches, that's a definite no. And this is where the problem comes up. But the biggest thing that gets me is the inconsistency of the traditional churches. They'll claim to be historical, they'll claim to follow the 7 ecumenical councils, they'll claim that they represent the faith once for all delivered, but when you go through the history and cite all the examples where they're not acting in accord with history, or history simply changed, where one thing was thought at one time and then it slowly morphed into something else, which is usually what happens. Sudden changes usually do not affect the churches that much, but slow changes do, because slow changes you don't tend to notice except in great retrospect, and that's where Protestantism really has an advantage, because we can look and see if things have changed from the past, but the traditional churches do not look at it that way. Whenever you point this kind of stuff out to them, they always try to find some way around it, and this is one of those cases. They say Pelagius is on one side, Augustine's on the other, and they completely ignore the fact that Augustine wasn't the one who was anathematized. In fact, what he had to say was in fact canonized, and not just in synod, also in ecumenical council. They completely ignore that, and it bugs the tar out of me. So what I'm saying right here is simply this: Eastern Orthodoxy is not consistent with its own claims. They claim to be the historical faith, but that's only true so long as the history happens to agree with them. And if a particular emblem of history that they say that they agree with doesn't, they basically just ignore it. Oh, we believe the 7 ecumenical councils, except for the 7th ecumenical council, which adopts original sin, because we reject original sin, so we're good except for that one. And so on and so forth. It's not consistent. And if a group isn't consistent, it's really hard to trust them. That's all I really have to say about that. Look into the actual canon notes. Read what the Church Fathers had to say. And granted, I as a Protestant, there's lots that they say that I don't agree with. When I was reading the part about the infant baptism and regeneration, Protestants don't necessarily believe in baptism regeneration, not in the sense that a lot of the Church Fathers did. We would say there's some base, and that's our view on that one.
And the one thing that you will definitely find is there's lots of different opinions out there, including the Church Fathers. They didn't always agree with one another. And a lot of the Church Fathers who different groups would claim are their Church Fathers usually wouldn't toe the party line completely one way or another. For example, a lot of the Alexandrian Fathers have a lot in common with modern-day Protestants in a great many respects, but not completely. There's some things we would definitely disagree on. And of course, most of the Western Fathers would go for Roman Catholicism, most of the Eastern Fathers would go for Eastern Orthodoxy, but none of them completely toe the party line. For example, Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism are very adamant that the Old Testament canon, whatever it is, that it's bigger than the Protestant canon. The Eastern Orthodox still refuse to fix their Old Testament canon, so I'm not really sure how they can really have much of a claim against Protestants when they don't technically even have an Old Testament, but that issue aside, they like to claim that it's larger, and they would say that this is a part of the traditional church. And the problem is that when you look at most of the specific Church Fathers and what most of the specific Church Fathers had to say about the canon, especially the canon of the Old Testament, most of them actually come out on the side of a short Old Testament canon. There are relatively few who would actually put in all of what, from the Protestant perspective, is the extra books. And this is something that can be traced, first, second, third century, very early on. There was a great deal of consistency about what the Old Testament was. And it really isn't until we start getting in more toward the Middle Ages that's adding on the apocryphal books, what Protestants call the apocryphal books, really becomes a normal thing. Until then, it's very rare. But are the traditional churches going to say that? Are they going to reveal that information, that a lot of what they have and a lot of their thoughts, such as the propitiation that happens during the Mass, during the Eucharist, and those kinds of things, that those are much more so medieval ideas than they are actually early church ideas? Are they going to talk about that? And usually not. Or even in Eastern Orthodoxy, are they going to admit that the distinction that is now used between God and His essence and God and His energies, which is a very popular explanation in Eastern Orthodoxy, that idea wasn't come up with until roughly a century or two before the Reformation happened, that it's relatively close in that time frame there, that it is so far removed from the beginning? They're very selective with their history, and frankly I don't think that a lot of them know as much as their history as they think they do. And like I said, I'm not saying that Protestants do follow the history, because frankly we don't. We're not bound to it. But when other people say that they are bound to it, and yet they act inconsistently in that, and they don't actually follow what the histories say, and they ignore simple facts like, we think that both of these people are wrong, but only one of them was actually condemned in council, the other one was the one who was advocated in council, and when they ignore things like that, it kind of makes us sit back there, scratch our heads, and say, no, that's a really inconsistent thing to say. This is the problem that I have with the traditional churches. They are inconsistent regarding their own history, even though they hold their history in such high esteem. When it comes right down to it, they don't really practice the historical faith. They practice the historical faith as they want to, not as it actually was, at least not in every respect, and frankly no group does, as humankind is fallible. But for them, it results in inconsistencies, and ones that are not very well supported in the history at all. That's what I got to say about that. Obviously, not going to make me too many friends on the side of traditional churches, but it is what it is. Thank you for your time. Go with God, and be blessed.